Dzień dobry Państwu. Weronika
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Weronika Gawlicka-Dulikis, Janusz Kurtyka Foundation. It is my honor to invite you to a meeting that is a part of Seeds of History 3.0, the relay race of generations, entitled General Foch and his contribution to Polish independence. May I welcome today's guests. We have with us Professor Andrzej Chwalba, Professor of History, Professor Emeritus of Institute of History of the Jagiellonian University in Kraków, an excellent expert in the 19th and 20th centuries history, mostly social, but also cultural and political Polish-Russian relations in the history of the Jagiellonian University and Kraków. Member of multiple scientific councils, multiple museum councils in Poland and abroad. Recipient of the Janusz Kurtyka competition for the book Great War of Poles, 1914-1918. The book was translated into English and German. Good evening, Professor. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening, Madam. Dr. Damian Bębnowski, Deputy President of the Janusz Kurtyka Foundation and the moderator of the event today. Good evening. Welcome so warmly. Good evening. The Seeds of History 3.0 is financed from the funds of the Chancellor of the President of the Council of Ministers as part of Polonia 2023 competition. The media partners are Block Press and British Post. May I now ask Dr. Damian Bębnowski, Deputy President of the Foundation, to take the floor. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm so glad that this meeting again, a meeting of this type again, becomes a part of our project entitled Seeds of History, a project by Janusz Kurtyka Foundation in Warsaw, whose goal and purpose is to promote internationally the achievements of Polish historians with the use of the potential and experience of Polonia communities in various corners of the world. Practically, the goal of this project is to create a network of contacts around Janusz Kurtyka Foundation, which uses this project to work with Polonia in the US, UK, Austria, Germany, and Canada as well. This is already the third round, the third edition of this project, which we have run since 2021, and precisely thanks to the co-financing from the Chancellery of the President of the Council of Ministers. As part of the activities we undertake, we launch cooperation, as I have mentioned, with the Polonia, the Polish diaspora, noticing their potential, their subjectivity, and also their experience in contacts with various cultural institutions, social institutions, wherever those institutions operate in the countries I have listed. And we also ask those Polonia organizations that work with our foundation, we ask them to help us distribute the books that we publish. And we publish very good books, very precious, that show the achievements of Polish art of history, which has always been at the world level or Western level that provides the tune for the contemporary historiography. And these are usually the books that won the prize of Janusz Kurtyka Foundation, which our foundation organizes annually. For the prize is the translation of the best history book into English and German and publishing it abroad in cooperation with a recognized West European publisher, and then its distribution in various intellectual centers in the West. For that, we invite, among others, the organizations of the Polish
Dodatkowo
diaspora
uwzględnia
of the
naszym
Polonia as part
laureatom,
of the
a
Seeds of
jest
History.
nimi w tym
Additionally,
nasz dzisiejszy
to our
gość, pan
winners, and
profesor
our
Andrzej Chwalba,
guest
któremu
today,
już
Professor
teraz
Andrzej Chwalba, is one
serdecznie
of the winners
dziękuję
of this
po raz
prize.
kolejny przyjął
Professor, may I
nasze
thank you
zaproszenie,
for
aby
accepting
wygłosić
our
odczyt
invitation
na
again,
zaproponowany przez nas
accepting it,
temat.
this invitation to
Zarówno
deliver a
naszym
paper
laureatom,
on
jak
a
i
subject we
innym
propose.
badaczom
To our
proponujemy
winners and also
wygłaszanie
to other
spotkań,
lecturers, we
które
offer
są organizowane we
meetings that
współpracy z
are
organizacjami polonijnymi
co-organized
z
with
którymi
organizations
nawiązujemy
of the
współpracę.
Polonia
W
with
ramach
which
projektu
we have
Ziarna
launched
Historii udało
cooperation.
nam się
Seeds of History
zorganizować
so
również
far and as yet
konferencje
have
dyskutujące o
managed to
wyzwaniach
organize
mianowicie
conferences
działalności
on
organizacji polonijnych w
challenges of the
różnych krajach
Polonia organizations
możliwie
in
właśnie w
various countries
zakresie
worldwide
popularyzowania
in
wiedzy o
matters
polskiej
like
historii,
promotion of Polish
popularyzowania
history,
dorobku
also
rodzimej
promotion of the
historiografii.
achievements of
Doceniamy
Polish
także wkład
historians. We also
przedstawicieli
very
Polonii
strongly
w
appreciate the
zakresie, w
contribution
zakresie
of what
upamiętniania, w
our members
zakresie
of the
promowania
Polonia have done
dorobku
to
polskiej
commemorate and to
historiografii,
promote the
przyznając
achievements of Polish
nagrodę
uh, historical
coroczną
sciences
nagrodę
by awarding the
przyszłość właśnie tego
annual
rodzaju
past future
organizacjom czy
prize to
indywidualnym
such
działaczom w
organizations and
kategorii
to
Polonia i
individual
Polacy
activists
za granicą.
in the categories
Stworzyliśmy
of
także
Polonia or Polish
podstronę o
diaspora
polskiej
and
historii,
Poles abroad. We
o
have a
wybranych
subsite on
wydarzeniach,
Polish history,
procesach
the
z naszych
selected
rodzimych dziejów
events
związanych z
and
polskim
moments
sowieckim i
in
niemieckim do
our
współtworzenia, której
past.
zaprosiliśmy
And we've
uznane
invited
autorytety
recognized
z polskiego
authorities
świata
to participate
naukowego,
in
a
creating
także
it, authorities in
interaktywną
the
bazę
Polish
danych
academic
na
world.
temat
And we
katedr
also have an
polskich na
interactive database
uniwersytetach
on
amerykańskich. Do tej
Polish
pory
cathedrals. It
we
is available
współpracy
on
z organizacjami
US
polonijnymi, które
universities.
zechciały
As
wejść do
yet,
naszej sieci,
working with the
udało nam się
organizations of the
rozdystrybuować
Polonia, we've managed to
kilkaset
distribute
egzemplarzy
several hundred
książek,
copies
które
of
były przez nas
the
wydawane
books that we have
właśnie w
published
ramach
as
projektu
part
Nagroda
of
imienia Janusza
the Janusz
Kurtyki i
Kurtyka
które to
Prize
prace ukazały
project.
się
And
nakładem
these
takich
works have been
domów
published
wydawniczych
by
jak
such
Carolina
publishing
Academic
houses
Press w
as
Stanach Zjednoczonych,
Carolina
Peter
Academic
Lang w
Press in the
Niemczech,
US, Peter Lang in
De
Germany,
Gruyter,
De Gruyter,
Routledge,
Routledge.
więc
So,
wykorzystując potencjał tych
exploiting
opracowań,
the potential
czynimy
of those
starania,
works,
aby te
we make
książki
every effort
również
to have
dzięki
these
pomocy i
works, also
wsparciu
thanks to the aid
naszych
and
partnerów
support of
polonijnych
our
dotarły
partners from
do jak
Polonia, that
największej
they
grupy
reach the
potencjalnie
largest
zainteresowanych
possible
czytelników. Raz jeszcze
circles of
dziękuję panu
potential
profesorowi
readers,
Chwalbie
of
za
readers
przyjęcie
interested in that.
naszego
May I once
zaproszenia
again extend
i
cordial gratitude to Professor
z
Chwalba
chęcią
for
i wielką
accepting our
przyjemnością
invitation,
oddaję
and
panu
with great
profesorowi
pleasure
głos,
and
bo przed nami bardzo
eagerness do I pass
interesujący
the mic to
obór.
you,
Dziękuję
Professor, because
serdecznie.
we're in for a real treat. Thank you very much.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much,
Przede
sir.
wszystkim chciałem bardzo
First of
podziękować
all, I'd like
Fundacji
to thank very
imienia
much
Janusza
the
Kurtyki
Janusz
za
Kurtyka
zaproszenie.
Foundation for
Dla mnie jest
this
to
invitation
wielka
to
przyjemność
me.
współpracować
It
już
is a
od
great
dłuższego
pleasure
czasu.
to be
No i to jest zaszczyt
cooperating for quite a long time by
współpracy.
now. And it's
Fundacja
definitely an honor
należy
because
do
the
dominujących
foundation
instytucji w
is
Polsce
one
wspierających
of the leading
powstanie
institutions in
polskiej
Poland
obrazy
that
w
support
świecie,
the
polską
building of
historiografię
the
na miarę
image of Poland in the
wojnową.
world, Polish
Jest
historiography
postrzegana
that
przez
has
władze
laid
kulturowe,
certain
różnych
services, that
anglosaskich,
is
tylko
perceived by
również
the
na
English
Daleki
speaking
Wschodzie.
academic world, but
Także
also by the
mam też nadzieję, że
academics from the Far East.
fundacje
So I also
kolejne
hope that
wykłady
through the
adresowane
foundation, there will be
znajdującego po
more
świata, po prostu
lectures
świata
that will
Ameryki
be addressed to the
dotyczą.
world, to America,
Temat
to
jest bardzo
different
ciekawy,
countries.
bowiem
The subject
Ferdynand
today
Foch
is very
jest
interesting because Ferdinand
postacią
Foch
nieco jednak
is
zapomnianą.
a figure that's been
Nie tylko
slightly
w Polsce, ale w
forgotten, not
Europie,
only in
a jego
Poland, but
zasługi dla
throughout Europe.
architektury
And
europejskiej
his achievements
po
for
zakończeniu
the
Wielkiej Wojny,
uh,
jego
political
zasługi
architecture
również
in
dla
Europe after the
tego, co
Great,
nazywamy
Great
sprawą
War,
polską, czyli
and also his services for what we call the Polish case, the establishment of Polish independence, are absolutely indisputable. After 1989, I got 2 phone calls from Kraków journalists with a request. What did it result from? It was the time when the authorities of Kraków were ordering the visual and symbolic space of the city and changing the names of the schools, streets, squares, when the communist names were being rejected, and Ferdynand Foch was reintroduced into the name of one street. 2 papers asked me, "Sir, tell me, what did this Foch do good for Poland if we replacing Pushkin, who was an aficionado of Poland, who worked with Adam Mickiewicz, the greatest poet, we replace him with a Ferdinand Foch?" I remember that statement. It was years ago. It really struck me, this lack of knowledge among journalists. I'd say they were not the youngest. These were not kids of 20. They were journalists who were developed in the communist Poland, and they knew that Pushkin was a great friend of Poles, which was not necessarily true, but they knew nothing or nothing sensible about Marshal Foch. Luckily, I gave them information. Whether they were happy, I don't know, but definitely they published what I said. I don't know how it was in different cities with bringing back the memory, because returning a name, the name of Foch in this case, to the Polish symbolic space, this Polish cultural visual landscape, it certainly resulted in the need to become familiar with a person. As we're talking about Ferdinand Foch, let's first say a few things about him as a figure. He was believed to be the key figure in the Allied armies fighting against the countries of the Axis, and he was considered the main architect of the victory of the Allied forces against the Central States, notably the Second Reich. He was actually a typical representative of the French officer elites. He started as a non-commissioned officer and went up to the highest echelons and ranks. It was quite typical. He was an officer of artillery. And he also studied at the Technical University of Paris. That's why he was interested in military technique and modernization of equipment, such as artillery, for example. The famous 75 millimeter French cannons, which were really executing the enemies during the war, and they served Poland as well.
And then they were used in Poland in 1939. That was the basic Foch piece of artillery in the name of Ferdinand Foch, and it was quite effective on battlefields in September 1939. And when the war started in September, he was the commander of the corps, and then he was nominated the commander of the 9th Army, French Army, and then in September 1914 he took part in the First Battle of Marne. That was actually a very famous victory at the Marne that was quite unexpected, and the German plans failed. The German troops have been stopped just dozens kilometers away from their target, and that was actually the merit of Ferdinand Foch. Therefore, the French government and the French generals started looking with greater attention at Foch. All the more that the chief of staff of the French army, General Joffre, he was a good staff officer, but perhaps he was not the most brilliant one. Then it turned out that during his when he was in command, he did make a couple of mistakes. Foch was fighting at Verdun, at the Somme, at Verdun, and after General Joffre, General Neville, his successor, turned out to be even less effective in battle. Then the political decision was taken by the French most important politicians, that is, by President Calais, and therefore Ferdinand Foch was nominated as the chief of staff. Well, the chief of staff was the commander-in-chief, de facto commander-in-chief of the French army, but that was May 1917, and several months later, he became commander-in-chief of all Allied troops on the Western Front. That is, of the French, British troops, and in the case of the American troops, it was more complicated than that, but actually Americans had to coordinate their activities with Ferdinand Foch. Also, the Polish army in France was commanded in the second half of 1918. The Polish army, right from Russia, the former legionnaire, General Józef Haller, was commanding the Polish troops, and that is a very important name. Important name also for that reason that despite the great difference in age, both gentlemen respected each other, actually liked each other, and Foch did cherish the organizational talent and the strategic wit of Józef Haller, and also he admired his courage. As far as the Allied troops are concerned, there was the Portuguese army, the Belgian army, and some detachments that were seconded. Also, even some Brazilian detachments joined the Allied forces, and those were rather symbolic detachments. However, all of them were commanded by General Foch. General Foch, which means that the Polish army by Haller, although it was the Polish army, it was operating under the French command, but also its operations after World War I were coordinated between Haller and Foch. It was not like that Józef Piłsudski, as the head of state, was calling General Haller and saying, "Listen, dear Józef," because they were calling each other by their first name. I would say they were really good pals at the time. And he wouldn't say that just get the soldiers back to the train, go back to Poland, Poland needs it. No, no. He had to coordinate that with the French commander. Initially, it was expected that the Haller army will indeed be transported to Poland. And that was in April 1919, 67,000 troops, really well-equipped and well-trained soldiers. That was actually the best army formation, Polish army formation. But that agreement of the Allies, that agreement with the government in Poland, with the government in Warsaw, with the agreement with Piłsudski, assumed that Haller would be fighting against the Bolsheviks only. Well, it happened in a different way, because Haller's army also fought against the army of the Ukrainian Republic in the territory of the former Galicia. That also caused some tensions, and those tensions were managed both in London and in Paris by General Ferdinand Foch. Later, Ferdinand Foch was nominated the Marshal of France. He was nominated the Marshal of France. That is a very rare distinction. It's not like in the Soviet Russia that any army general, almost any army general, was nominated marshal. In case of France, it's quite an exception. Becoming a marshal of France is a sign of recognition of the Allied countries and of the French. It was paying tribute to his organizational skills. It's also paying tribute to his capacity of being in good contact with the soldiers. It's also a tribute to his good negotiation skills. So Ferdinand Foch is usually associated with this famous picture of the railway car to the sidetrack in a forest, not far from Compiègne, not far from Compiègne. Compiègne was the place where the Great War ended. Definitely the Germans were recognized as those who were defeated. And that was in the office in that military railway car. This is where the Germans agreed to the capitulation, not a non-conditional capitulation yet, but this is how the armistice started. The armistice, in fact, was the act of unconditional capitulation. This is when the Germans accepted the conditions dictated by Ferdinand Foch. Obviously, that was not only his political decision and it was not only his will. The content of the document that was presented to the Germans for their acceptance, it was the result of negotiation between the American, British, French generals with the participation of President Wilson. Some of his points, well, actually his points formed the basis for the negotiations on the armistice in negotiations with the Germans. And this is what happened. The Germans didn't have any way out. Their army was in disarray. Therefore, they accepted the dictate of the Allied forces. And now, in the territory of Poland, the Great Poland Uprising started. That was successful initially. We should remember that was at Christmas 1918 when Poznań saw the arrival of the greatest pianist on the greatest pianist in the history of Poland. As far as his pianist skills are concerned, Ignacy Paderewski came to Poznań, and this is when the uprising started. The Greater Polish Army was established. That was headed by Józef Dowbor-Pusznicki, a friend of Haller. Earlier on, he was the commander of the First Polish Corps in Russia. A really outstanding general, a good organizer, but it turned out that after the first upheaval in Germany and after the revolution, the Germans started managing their situation internally. The Weimar Republic was established, the National Assembly was established, they elected the Chancellor and the President, and the Germans started putting their post-war fate into order. They started reinforcing their armed forces, as their armed forces were still in high level of readiness, despite the process of disarmament, of the ongoing process of disarmament. Therefore, the Germans in the Greater Poland Front launched a counter-offensive, and the Polish front was buckling, and this is when the Polish depeche were addressed to General Ferdinand Foch, and with the text, "Dear Ferdinand, help us, do something, the Germans are winning." Well, of course, one cannot compare the potential of just one district in the Greater Poland that had a great army, but just a couple of tens of thousands of soldiers, but the Germans dispatched more than 100,000 troops with heavy weapons. And then Ferdinand Foch immediately reacted. he immediately sent an ultimatum to the Germans and said, you must stop immediately. You must stop all combat operations immediately. If you do not stop, then the French army will advance and will go into Germany. Therefore, the conditions that were signed by the Germans in Compiègne would no longer be treated as an entry point. Therefore, more sanctions would be imposed on Germany. So the Germans again were in a difficult situation, in a crux, because that was the Paris dictate, the dictate of Foch. So they had to agree. They were compelled to agree. Therefore, deep in their hearts, the Poles received that help in due time. Otherwise, we don't know what would have happened. Also, the British thought that the Greater Poland should not necessarily be part of Poland, more so Pomerania. They thought that those two lands should be joined together, and probably they should be given autonomy, but within the frontiers of the Weimar Republic. But that was the idea that was opposed by the French. Of course, the French had their own vested interest in it. In politics, there is always a play of interest. Of course, being nice is being nice, but it's important to have political interests, and having nice relations helps to negotiate and to create good conditions. But what is most important in politics is interests. Foch was anti-German almost obsessively, but that was the result of the fact that the Great War was a traumatic war. That war cost the French a lot. Not only in financial terms, they lost 1,400,000 French who died during the war. And until World War II, the French were not capable of making up for the losses incurred by the Great War. And the pacifism that spread around France after the end of the war was the aftermath of that loss. And the French were still concerned that yet another war would still be possible. It's quite interesting what words were taken down by journalists. Those were the words said by Ferdinand Foch when the war, when negotiations in Versailles were finished, when the Treaty of Versailles was being signed. He said, "This is not peace. It is an armistice for 20 years." In 1939, those words were quoted. He was right. Exactly 20 years later, yet another war started. So let us remember that Foch really helped Greater Poland uprising. And after Piłsudski's motions to share weapons, munitions, artillery, it all helped. In 1919, Poland did not have yet factories to produce the military kit. There were problems even with producing rounds for the machine guns, and the occupying force were not building during the war or before the war any military factories in the territory of later Poland. Therefore, the Poles were doomed to buy the weapons, demobilized weapons, and the French weapons in particular, and they were forced to purchase the British weapons. Well, the buyers immediately were asking for sky-high prices for the weapons that were transferred to Poland. Only Ferdinand Foch made them to start selling at market prices, sometimes at a loan, because Poland did not have free cash that could be invested in purchasing those weapons.
And it was obvious and visible that serious conflict with Russia was brewing. The war waged on, and it wasn't really sure how this war was going to end. In 1919, the Polish army was gradually moving eastwards, chasing the Red Army away, but in northeast, near Vilna, there was a conflict between the Polish raison d'être with the Lithuanian ones. Lithuania believed that Vilnius of Algirdas of Gediminas was the capital of the the first princes, was their capital, although it didn't have any major population of Lithuanians. But historically, they were right, because the city was the capital of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Ethnically, it was a Polish, or rather a Polish-Jewish city. Now, what was the decision of the Allies in these circumstances? Their decision was not evident. The situation between Poles, Belarusians, and Lithuanians was to have the Foch line, a demarcation line. The Vilnius and Vilnius region up to Dvina River was assigned to Poland. Hard to say whether a demarcation line would be the final line. That called for peaceful negotiations. Nevertheless, Poles wanted to believe, and had all the reasons to believe, that this was what was going to happen. Let's remember, the Foch line, he's got the copyright for such a division of aspirations and ambitions between such nations as Belarusians, who now wanted to have their own country, and they created it, even if they had problems with placing it, because the war was changing their moods and their dreams, while the Lithuanians very powerfully became really set in the region of Kaunas, of Kovno, and had appetites for Hrodna, for Suwałki, and for many other areas up to the Dvina River. Now, what about the Foch demarcation line? When Piłsudski started his offensive in April 20 against the Red Army, then Poles were retreating, and when Bolsheviks reached Warsaw, the Prime Minister of Poland went to Spa. It wasn't Spa and Wellness, it was just a town called Spa, where the prime ministers of Great Britain and others were then in session. Great Britain was the most important player in that alliance, and they dictated very tough conditions to Poland, imposing the so-called Curzon line on the Bug and west of the Niemen River, which meant that the Foch line became history. It became history, but after Żeligowski's rebellion, this final border between Poland and Lithuania and Poland and Latvia ran nearly along the demarcation line, that's the one drawn by Foch. During the negotiations in Spa, Foch did not have the decisive voice. However, this line is worth remembering. Now, following Foch's initiative, Poland in 2019 received a military mission which had more than 1,000 officers and and commissioned officers. Then Piłsudski said that there were too many French in Poland, and if Poland won, they would claim that these were the French who won the war against the Bolsheviks, and Piłsudski counted on being the only victor. That's why this mission was reduced to 200, 300, 400 people, Nevertheless, they were in individual divisions, in individual squadrons, and importantly, they lectured at the higher academy of higher military academy. For many years later, they would also lecture there. They were even lecturers in several schools for officers. In Haller's army, let me reiterate, in April and May 1919, he reached Poland. Most of the commanders were French. In Haller's army, Poles were few because where could you get them during the war from? Now that they arrived, there were the French there who, in a way, were supervised by Ferdinand Foch. Again, it requires mentioning that among the officers who were in the French mission in Poland, there was Captain Charles de Gaulle, who was later the head of the Committee of Free France in the Second World War, and even later than that, the President of the Republic. His memoirs from Poland are well known. He was generally friendly to Poles, but he noticed civilizational delay. He believed that Warsaw was a city that had too strong Russian imprint on it, too strong mark of Asia. He believed it to be more Asian than European city. But coming back to Foch, another important initiative of his was that in this dramatic moment, when after the capture of Grodno, the armies, the Bolshevik armies were very quickly coming to Warsaw, when the temporary revolutionary committee was set up in Białystok with Kohn, Marchlewski, and Dzierżyński. They already saw Warsaw red. They saw themselves the commissars of Warsaw, ruling Warsaw on behalf of the government in Kremlin, and they established the Polish Soviet Republic, which was to be a part of the future Soviet Federation or state. At the time, it didn't yet exist, by the way. And he sends a very important French general, the head of staff, General Maxime Weygand was an eminent French general, and Foch trusted Weygand. However, Weygand was there for a very short time, and he couldn't really read this war. He looked at the Polish Bolshevik War from the perspective of his experiences in the Western Front, so a trench war, position war. Polish armies couldn't really afford a trench war, the more so as the Bolshevik army was progressing fast, was moving on fast, and cavalry reached even Płock and Włocławek, the northwest of Warsaw. The situation was really dramatic. So participation of Weygand himself in the Battle of Warsaw was practically immaterial. Nevertheless, Western journalists, Americans, French, also Germans, would comment the battle and said that it was Maxime Weygand who was the victor. It's not Piłsudski who's mentioned in the books and articles, various texts or radio stories. It was Weygand who honestly said that it was Piłsudski who was the winner, and that it was the Polish army who had such a concept for battle, and that they are the winners, not me. My role was modest. They didn't want to believe that a Piłsudski, who never completed any military academy, could have conducted such a marvelous and well-designed and perfectly well-executed operation. This was only when Poland was being built, so there was no trust for some creation that was only there in the making, the more so as the German propaganda at the time in 19 and 20 called Poland a seasonal, short-lived creature. Now, referring to Marshal Foch, it's worth remembering that he also supported the Polish effort to regain Silesia. That failed, but when the Silesian uprisings broke out after the first one, Foch decided to send his friend, General Henri Leronde, who was the head of the French mission in Upper Silesia and who is really the executor of Foch's intention. The French couldn't do much. They were treated as the armistice forces. However, in various ways, they supported not only diplomatically, but also materially supported the insurgents in Silesia. The fact that after the plebiscite and the third insurgency, that part of Upper Silesia came to Poland, most of the industrial lands, was also significantly influenced by Ferdinand Foch himself. That is the reason why many Polish universities believed it to be a great honor if Ferdinand Foch received their honorary doctorates. It started, there was a whole series, there were plenty of such universities, those who had the right to award it. The first was the Technical University of Lvov, or Lviv. Remember, he was an engineer. So back in 2018, it was them, then the Jagiellonian University, then other universities. In 23, the Polish parliament, to the motion from the Polish government, the Minister for Military Affairs was an eminent legionary and strategist, General Kazimierz Sosnkowski, passed a motion to award General Foch with a Frenchman would said Monsieur Foch, we say Fochowi. We in Polish have declension of nouns, so he became the marshal, and that was the first and the only foreign officer in the history of Poland between the two world wars who received such an honor. This proves what great respect, if not love, he enjoyed in the interwar Poland, and how very much he was appreciated for the role he played during the most important events in 17 and 18, when Poland was getting ready to become a part of Europe, to regain its independence, and then how he helped to protect the Polish borders later until even 1920. However, before Ferdinand Foch arrives in Poland, let us remember that already at the time he was the Marshal of France. In 19, he also received this honor from the British Parliament to the motion of the British government, awarded him with the title of a Marshal of the United Kingdom.
So before he had arrived to Poland, he had been conferred with this title in France and Britain. So actually, that's the only person in the 20th century Europe who was conferred with the title of the Marshal by the three victorious states in the Great War. But before that happened, before that happened. Let us think about the visit of the head of state, of the former head of state, after the elections, once the president was another president, so the former head of country, but head of state, but the most important person in France paid a visit, and that was the result of the fact that Poland and France entered into a political and military alliance. So Piłsudski was received in Paris, in France, with the greatest honors. And he made a beautiful gesture as he was welcoming with Ferdinand Foch, as he was preparing to give a speech. He took off from his own military uniform the Virtuti Militari order and pinned it to the military uniform of Ferdinand Foch. He did it himself. He took Virtuti Militari off his own chest and gave it to Ferdinand Foch. Unprecedented gesture that caused immense enthusiasm in France. And as they were writing about the visit about Piłsudski, they were writing about that gesture, about Virtuti Militari. Actually, a movie was done about that. And after the visit and after the lecture at the military academy, in Paris, on his way back, Piłsudski already knew that Ferdinand Foch was conferred the title of the Marshal of Poland. In May, Foch went to Poland so as to receive the baton of the Marshal. His train, that was the beginning of May, that was on the 1st or the 2nd of May, he entered the Dziedzic station in Silesia, that was the frontier of the Prussian Silesia and Poland, and that baton was given to him by General Sąskowski, whom I mentioned before, and is usually the case in such ceremonies. The gentleman went to Warsaw, as the most important ceremonies and meetings were taking place in Warsaw. None of the meals eaten by Foch were in private. All of those were official dinners, breakfasts, and luncheons with speeches, many meetings. He also read lectures. He received the pride of the Polish army, and he was holding military and political talks about Polish-French cooperation on the topic of a possible conflict when Germany would be in conflict with both Western and Eastern neighbors. That is, should Germany be in conflict with France, Poland, or Czechoslovakia? Already then, they were thinking about this possible future conflict. And there is an interesting point of ceremonies that occurred in Warsaw. He was taking part in unveiling a monument to Prince Poniatowski. That was on the 3rd of May in Warsaw. And let us actually the monument by Thorwaldsen, a very famous sculptor, and he did have his workshop in Rome, so the cast itself was done in Rome. And that monument was there to be erected before early on, but the November uprising made things more complicated. And after the Russian imperial period, that monument returned to Poland after the Treaty of Riga. The Treaty of Riga obliged the Soviet authorities to return cultural assets back to Poland. So the cultural assets included the monument to Józef Poniatowski, which was a very symbolic symbolic moment because Poniatowski was the Marshal of France. He was the only Polish officer who was conferred with the title of the Marshal of France, and he was the only foreigner to have been conferred with this title. And when several days later, Marshal Foch was visiting Kraków, and he went to the Wawel Castle Hill, and he went to the place where there is beautiful sarcophagus of Prince Poniatowski. And let us remember that we know that he was buried in that sarcophagus next to Polish kings at the Wawel Cathedral. This is where Foch stopped by. He laid flowers, and this is where he spoke to the Polish officers. That was a very long journey, because later on he traveled around a number of Polish cities and towns. He was conferred the title of Dr. Honoris Causa. Then he went to Lwów, and then he went to Kraków. And there in Kraków, he received the title of Dr. Honoris Causa that had been conferred upon him earlier on in 1918. So there were many speeches. Obviously, the speeches by the Polish partners were much longer than Foch's speeches. He was just like a soldier. He was speaking briefly, concisely, using colorful phrases and words. But it's important to talk about the most important conversation with Piłsudski in Kraków. This is when they outlined the Polish objectives, the French objectives and the French possibilities should Germany attack either east or west. Because the French troops entered the Ruhr region as the Germans were not paying their financial compensation to France as they were obliged to pay. So that caused hysterics and calls for waging war against France. But the French were concerned that would actually be a real war, though, so they needed an ally in the east. There was no longer Russia there. The Bolsheviks, Russia had very different plans, and as the attitude of the Bolsheviks was very negative to the Treaty of Versailles, just like the Germans. Bolsheviks were very critical about the Treaty of Versailles. Therefore, the French were very active in Poland and in Czechoslovakia because they saw Poland as a substitute, so to speak. Obviously, Poland, together with Czechoslovakia, would not be as strong as Russia might have been, but still, both Poland and Czechoslovakia were forming a possible backstage. So there was a possibility that the Polish army would attack the Eastern Prussia, so to make Königsberg yet another Polish port, so that to take the free city of Danzig. So all of those plans were fairly well outlined. And at that time, Piłsudski and the Polish generals and also Marshal Foch were not excluding a possibility that there may be a war in 1923 in autumn between France, Germany, and Poland. That was the matter of the preventive war. We know the notion of the preventive war, and there was a lot of talk about the prevention war in the beginning of the 1930s, but actually that war was much more plausible in 1923. And at that time, the French were ready to intervene. They were at a much higher level of readiness than in 1939, when they behaved in a very different way. So let us think about the greatness and commemoration of greatness of Foch in Poland. So many names received his name: schools, parks, individual also many of the military detachments were bearing his name. So together with Napoleon, Foch was the most famous French politician in Poland. And in primary schools, for instance, lectures were read about Foch. He was in the textbooks. He was the man who secured independence for Poland. He was the one who secured good place for Poland in history. He was the one who was taking great care about his heritage or his investments into the Polish defense capabilities so that they would not be lost. Well, after he died, we no longer had such a friend in Paris. All the more so, availing of the opportunity that the Janusz Kurtyka Foundation thought of commemorating this person that is worth remembering. The Poles have this trait. We want to remember, we must remember about those who made us important members of the European community after the end of the Great War. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor, for this very interesting lecture. You have touched upon a number of very interesting topics that refer both to the life of General Foch and his links with Poland, all the more official, political and diplomatic at times ties with Poland, but also thank you for speaking about less formal ties with Poland, and also thank you for mentioning different forms of commemorating Marshal Foch and the way the Poles were expressing their gratitude to the Marshal for supporting the Polish cause in such a clear and unambiguous fashion, honoring him. We know that he was honored by Marshal Piłsudski by this direct gesture when he took his Virtuti Militari Cross and presented it to Marshal Foch when he was visiting France, or more official commemorations that were mentioned by Professor, when the French friend of Poland was receiving the titles of Doctor Honoris Causa in Kraków, Warsaw, Lwów, and Poznań. Professor, we would like, with your indulgence, to ask you a couple of questions. Does it mean that we can speak of a certain evolution in the perception of merits of Marshal Foch for Poland in different periods of our history, in our difficult history of the 20th century? As we know, our history has been marked with a number of qualitative changes as far as historical policy is concerned, as we have witnessed shifting of accents. There was a certain set of accents in the interwar period, but then it changed after the war, and also again those accents shifted in the times of the Third Polish Republic. So did the communists try to somehow push the merits of General Foch into the shadow? Could we trace what the communists were trying to do with memory about him so as to diminish the contribution of the French in regaining independence? So do we have marked differences in the way he was commemorated? And if so, is 1989 is a watershed, an important watershed. Is this the time when we have a new period of commemorating the merits of General Foch? And going back to those journalists you mentioned, so what did he actually do that Polish streets started receiving his names? Well, thank you very much. As we mentioned that in the interwar period, the Polish eagle was looking at the shield of the French, and that was the case until summer 1939. So, in fact, the French capital was very much present in Poland. Polish migrants were very well received and could take good jobs in the 1920s. Well, of course, during the crisis, it was somewhat different, but still, they were very much welcome.
There was perfect academic cooperation between Polish and French, and France was our ally number one. Obviously, we can speak about a certain asymmetry, because the fact that France was most important for us doesn't mean that Poland was most important for the French. Poland was one of the many countries, certainly important, very important, but the French somehow wanted to compensate those losses in Russia, and they invested into their image in Poland. That's something that looked very well in the 1930s. Due to their defensive strategy, construction of the Maginot Line, there were certain controversies between Poland and France, some bickering. We received a powerful injection of financial aid, loans, which made it possible to modernize the Polish army. And again, those relationships became warmer. Nevertheless, 38, 39, those relations were not as good as they had been in the days of Foch. Well, it was in his times, that in 23, that this secret staff, joint staff, Polish-French staff, Germans didn't know about it, was set up. There were two parts to it, one in Paris and the other in Warsaw. An attempt at setting up such a staff also with the English before September 39 didn't end in a success. The French were no longer so helpful, so there was this strange war of 39 and their strange strategy. Well, there were different names given to it, but let's remember that despite this alliance, which was renowned in May 39, where certain military affairs were fine-tuned, the French didn't start the intended offensive, and it was envisaged in this Polish-French compact, in the agreement, that our love of France is unilateral, one-sided. Some over the Seine call it tongue-in-cheek, commented upon tongue-in-cheek. Well, it was weaker and weaker. In the communist Poland, it was officially said that it was the Great October Revolution that gave freedom to Poland. As Professor Chrzanowski, the president of Civil Committee for Restoration of Kraków Heritage, said, this was claptrap or balderdash, and of course Poland was to be a part of the great Soviet Empire, nothing else than that, but that was a dogma and it was absolutely not to be challenged. All in any other initiatives and projects that conducted to the recovery of independence were marginalized or just wiped out, for which reason the name of Foch simply disappeared. They would paint over. There was the idea of Fornalska and Bierut, Stalin, Lenin, whoever was fashionable at the time. Foch was gone away. Napoleon was even removed. So they were really lost in the People's Republic. Naturally, the Eastern friends of Foch, Haller and Piłsudski, couldn't have their names. Their names were not even in dictionaries. They couldn't be positively remembered. All that was being destroyed in this huge mill of forgetting that looked first quite efficient because that wasn't in the books. There was the Treaty of Versailles, but the figure that received good press in books was Wilson, but that perhaps was the aftermath of his pacifism and of his power and of his pacifist ideas. So Woodrow Wilson was there, but his squares, his streets were also lost. Nevertheless, this 13th point of the 14th Wilson's points was retained. That's why this eradication of the Polish-French relationships, the absence of France in the history of the People's Republic due to the Iron Curtain, due to those episodes like the Jelcz-Berliet appearing, but who remembers Jelcz-Berliet, which was a very old French bus, and it didn't work well on Polish roads. And here, this French technical thought didn't show off from its best side. This was this best example of trying to make some economic links. In the days of Gierek, Poland heard some warmer words about the French also because Gierek, as previously Walloon miner, knowing French, he really appreciated this heritage of Poland and France. That was the time of particular warming of those contacts. This also was connected to a visit of de Gaulle. So those relations were even better than with other countries, like with the UK, and that didn't really work best about the historical remembrance of the People's Republic, that's Communist Poland. After 1889, though, the French became involved in business projects, but not cultural projects. Some French institutes, like the one in Warsaw, were really undergoing a siege, and they were gradually disappearing, as well as the knowledge of French. The Francophones were missing because there was this invasion of English through online means, so the English language traditions, and they were really replacing the remnants, the vestiges of the French traditions, and there was no such place, and Foch didn't have such a place either. So now a good word that I have for you, for Kurtyka Foundation. Thank you very much. Thank you for remembering about it, because this is a proof that we mustn't lose from our field of vision. We mustn't lose France, this capital that was invested once into our good relations by Ferdynand Foch. Thank you very much, Professor. As such a comment on your answer, because you've mentioned this knowledge of French which is disappearing in Poland, mostly among the intellectual elites in those academic circles. I believe that this is worth emphasizing. Until 1989, symptom of perhaps fascination is too strong a word, but major interest in France in history, in science, in education was cooperation and inspiration with the French Annales school, which also strongly contributed to the development of social. And Maria Curie Skłodowska also. Oh, yes, of course, Maria Curie as well. Professor, we have some more questions on our list. The following one concerns, I'll let myself read this question just as it is in the chat. What was Foch's attitude to Poland and Russia in 1920? I believe this is especially about the miracle on the Vistula and the dramatic moments for the Polish state during the Polish Bolshevik War. As I've mentioned, it was a decision of Ferdinand Foch that he was still the supreme commander of Allied forces in the West. That Allied idea was still there. And if it was there, then also the Polish army fighting Bolsheviks was also treated as part of that project born much earlier. We all allies. We have all allied our forces. This mission of Maxime Weygand was a proof of that. They didn't send here just a general, but the most important general. The most important general is the one who is the head of staff. And he did send the head of staff to help Poland order the retreat. We were retreating in quite an uncoordinated manner, in a very poor condition mentally, psychology. Various diplomatic missions were escaping to the West. The situation looked quite dramatic. Foch was aware of it. Hence, he decided to reinforce the intellectual and military potential. Speaking directly of politics, as I mentioned, in 1920, in this British-French tandem, the British were the more important, but during the war, or as such, in the French-British tandem, the French were more important. The roles have turned. That was because there was more destruction in France. There was no hostilities in Britain. And the other thing, due to the support that the British received from Americans. Americans supported the British, but the French were very often alone. And similar views like the famous, rather infamous in the Polish-British history, Lloyd George, the Prime Minister of UK, he said what also the Italians reiterated, and their message was quite different from that of the French. The French were actually on their own, so they couldn't proceed everything the way we would like to. Poles were waiting for the support of French and British Air Force. In 1920, the Allied didn't want to participate directly in that war. They had enough of that great war of theirs to again get involved in the East, the more so as the intervention of the Allied forces against Soviet Russia, Murmansk, for example, support of Denikin Wrangel did not end in a success for the Allied forces.
So they were not really eager to go into Eastern Europe because they didn't feel confident about that. Thank you. And the last question that we have, it's rather topic, Foch and the May coup d'etat in Poland. Well, Foch did not. Well, he was an elderly gentleman by that time, a retired Marshal of France, and someone else was writing the history then, so he didn't play any role, actually, but we know that the French were negative about the Piłsudski's activities. They were critical about Piłsudski at that time. The National Democracy was and Dmowski was the strongest figure in the government, and he was very liked by the French. But Piłsudski was treated as a serious soldier who is a military partner. However, the National Democrats were treated as the partners. They created the National Committee of Poland. They created the Halys Army. They were active in Paris in 1917, and therefore those were the National Democrats who were most pro-French. We know that Piłsudski was discreetly supported by the British diplomacy during the May coup, and we know that the main foreign partner in the context of scientific cooperation and as far as business cooperation was concerned, it was the British. Of course, the British could not exclude the French influences, but the British became very much active, who had not been present at the Vistula River before that, but now the British were in play. So the time of Foch was over by that time. Just as Professor has just mentioned, he was an elderly gentleman and he died 3 years later, in 1929. Yes, this is correct. Thus, Professor, we have exhausted the list of questions. Thank you very much for having accepted the invitation to read this very interesting lecture. So yet again, that has been a great honor for us to host you within the framework of our event organized by our foundation, and this has been the event organized within the framework of the project Seeds of History. Professor, thank you very much for giving answers to the questions that have been posted during the meeting, and this is how, at least a little bit, and at least symbolically, given the earlier formal commemoration of the merit of Foch for Poland, but this is how we have contributed by this evening tonight, and this is how we have been able to commemorate Foch and to recall his memory. And now I would like to give the floor to Weronika Gawińska-Brulikis from the Janusz Kortyka Foundation. Thank you very much for the participation in today's event. This has been the last meeting with a historian that we held as part of the Polish diaspora project Seeds of History 3.0, Relay of Generations, and we encourage you to listen to the lectures, which you can find on the YouTube channel of the Janusz Kortyka Foundation and blog posts in Polish, English, and German languages. Thank you very much. Goodbye.